Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us on another weekly walk. Today is Wednesday, November 8th, 2023. My name is Carla, and I'm an employee here with the Central Park Conservancy. And thank you for joining us for today's weekly walk, which is perhaps a little different than our other weekly walks, a Squirrel's Day in Central Park. And of course, just like with all of our weekly walks, we have our Zoom tools here. So please feel free to use the chat feature to say hello, add any comments that you would like to make about the presentation, friendly, positive comments. And if you have a question, you can use the Q&A feature. Click the Q&A feature on your toolbar. And I have my colleague Jose on the back end to help answer any of your questions today. And of course, a reminder also that you can turn off the chat if you'd like. You can close the chat window, and you can also turn off the little preview of the chat appearing below. And here at the Central Park Conservancy, of course, our mission is to preserve and celebrate Central Park as a sanctuary from the pace and pressures of city life, enhancing the enjoyment and well-being of all. And today, that includes not just humans like ourselves, but also some of our animal visitors to the park, such as squirrels. Now, our weekly walk is a little interesting today because as I set out to take some weekly walk photos for our presentation, unfortunately, I dropped my phone in the park and lost it. And I didn't find it until recently. And I thought I wouldn't have time to take pictures for the presentation. But in that time when I left my phone in the park, it would appear that perhaps another creature had taken my phone and took its own walk through the park and took these pictures from its own perspective as it made its way through Central Park. And so that is what we're going to enjoy today, are these pictures from someone else's perspective, from a squirrel's perspective. So we can see that the squirrel entered the park at 81st Street and then carefully makes their way along the path and crosses the drive and then gets a few views of the lake and some views of the Ramble. So let's take a look at where the squirrel walked through Central Park. So our squirrel friend here starts the walk at 81st Street. West 81st Street, and we can see already the view is a little bit different down here on ground level. And right away, our little squirrel friend spots some garbage cans to the right. And the squirrel thinks perhaps there's going to be a snack over there, that perhaps, there will be some litter or some food left outside, but these garbage cans are kept nice and tidy, both by our visitors and, of course, by the Central Park Conservancy staff. And so there aren't any errant crumbs here for our squirrel friend. But on the left-hand side of the path, there are some snacks for our squirrel friend. This is more what a squirrel should be eating, of course, are acorns. These are some gorgeous acorns that we can see. They're delicate little pinstripes in the sunshine. And if I had to guess, I think these might be pin oak acorns, but I'm not the expert on acorns that most squirrels are. And our squirrel friend can see as we look down the path that there's lots more oak trees that we'll be able to enjoy as we make our way down our walk. Now, when we think of a squirrel, when we say squirrel, many of us are probably thinking of the eastern gray squirrel, and that's what we're talking about today. That's what you would mostly see in Central Park. Now, the name squirrel comes from their scientific name, which is Squirrel carolinensis, probably not pronouncing that correctly. But the scurious part comes from the Greek, which means shadow and tail, which makes us think of their big bushy tail that they almost sit in the shadow of when they're sitting still. Now, our squirrel friend, as he's making his way through the park, happens to notice another four-legged creature in the park, a dog. Also a toddler. Either of these perhaps could be perceived as a predator of a squirrel. Luckily, the dog is on a leash, so maybe our squirrel friend feels a little bit more secure, but just in case, we might want to scurry right up a tree and the squirrel has chosen a really tall, towering oak tree. And up close, the squirrel can really enjoy a nice, close view of that unique bark of an oak tree. I believe that this is a red oak, if I had to guess. And they have slightly different bark, but there are also historical medicinal uses of all oak bark, whether it's a white oak or a red oak or a few different other types of oaks. And of course, some oaks are used to make wine barrels, which are supposed to impart a kind of vanilla taste. Sometimes people say that Chardonnay has kind of an oak taste, and some other things that are stored in those oak barrels. And the squirrel loves these kinds of large trees like oaks and hickories because they produce both food for the squirrel and also denning sites, or places for them to build their dens, or then in their branches they can build their nests that we'll talk more about in a moment. But of course, squirrels are not interested in wine or other materials that you might age in an oak barrel. Squirrels are more interested in the acorns that you would find, at the bottom of the tree. Now, eastern gray squirrels are native to our area, and they were once very common to see throughout the entire area, even in Manhattan, while Manhattan still had plenty of larger hardwood trees. But by the 1800s, a sighting of a squirrel actually became kind of rare because of their rapidly disappearing environment and food sources. So as Manhattan became deforested, there weren't as many places for squirrels to live and hide or sources of food for them. So in the late 1800s, squirrels were actually reintroduced to many American cities. It was sort of an attempt to bring more nature back into parks and sort of help man commune with nature. Think of some of the motivations in creating Central Park that we talk about, some similar motivations in wanting to bring back squirrels to our cities. Cities including New York City and places including Central Park. Now, these efforts were ultimately successful, but there were some challenges along the way because as they reintroduced squirrels, sometimes the numbers of those squirrels were too many squirrels. And then they felt like they had to then take various actions to reduce the number of squirrels that we won't get into any deep discussion of. There were times, however, when they would allow for hunting of squirrels because they thought that squirrels were hurting the trees and also perhaps endangering the bird population of some of the parks. This was a concern when the squirrel population got out of hand. Now, by the 1870s, these were some of the concerns, and they would hold early morning squirrel hunts. But then by the mid-1880s, there were an estimated 1,500 squirrels in Central Park. And of course, today you can find squirrels throughout all parks in New York City pretty much. And if you're curious as to just how many squirrels there are in Central Park, someone else was also quite curious, and they held a squirrel census that perhaps you've heard about. I think we've perhaps referred to it before. But there was a squirrel census in Central Park in 2019, and my colleague Jose is going to drop a link in the chat if you'd like to read more about the squirrel census and exactly how many squirrels were found and some of the interesting methods that they used to try and count those squirrels that are here in Central Park. In 2019, of course, just to give you a number, there were roughly 2,373 squirrels found or counted in Central Park, but that was based on observations of many, many volunteers and a special formula that they used. And again, you can read more at thesquirrelcensus.com. Now, making their way down the path, our little squirrel friend encounters some of the iconic benches of Central Park and takes a little hop up on the bench to get a nicer view down the path and see what is ahead of us here. It's also a good place to check if anyone sitting on the bench might have left a little bit of a snack, but thankfully our visitors are very thoughtful and they always put their trash in the trash receptacles, or perhaps a Conservancy staff member has come by and cleaned up the bench. That's also possible, but no snacks for our squirrel friend. So they might as well keep moving along. So now they're looking to cross the drive and continue on their walk through Central Park. And the late afternoon sun is almost blinding for our squirrel, but they do see an interesting structure in the distance there. And that is one of our rustic fences. And squirrels love rustic architecture because they love trees and branches, even if these are made out of black locust, not the squirrel's favorite oak tree. But this looks like it was just recently reconstructed by our rustic architecture team. But the squirrel wants to continue on their way here, so we'll keep making our way down the path. And in the distance, we can just start to see some glimpses of skyscrapers along Central Park South in the very distance there. And here we get a beautiful little glimpse of Oak Bridge in the distance. Now, if you didn't already know, Oak Bridge is the favorite bridge of squirrels because it's called Oak Bridge, and squirrels love oaks because of acorns. So our squirrel friend wants to get a little bit closer to that bridge. And they'll make their way down this path, pretty much going unnoticed by these visitors just ahead on the path. But our squirrel friend hears a rustling in the leaves on the right, and it looks like there is another squirrel in the leaves that you almost can't see because sometimes they blend right into those brown leaf colors, but there is the other squirrel. Now, I'm not very good, I don't know about you, I'm not able to gender squirrels, so I'm not sure whether this squirrel is a possible mate for our squirrel friend or not. But squirrels are ready to start looking for mates by their first year, by the end of their first year of life. And squirrels can have 2 mating seasons if conditions are right, if there's enough resources and food and safe habitat. They will have a mating season in late winter and also in midsummer. Now, the way that squirrels court is that competing males will chase a female squirrel during the courtship, and then the most dominant male in that chase ends up being the one who is the mate of the female squirrel. But no one is giving chase here. There's no romantic connection at this moment, so we will continue along. Now, maybe this squirrel is looking for something tasty in the leaves, so our squirrel friend takes a close look to see if perhaps they've missed something here to snack on, but it doesn't look like it. They just see a wide variety of leaves that are slowly breaking down and adding nutrients back into the soil and reminding us of the wide variety of tree species that are in the park. Some of these leaves would make a really great nest for a squirrel or a dray, as we mentioned before. But our squirrel friend doesn't have time to collect these leaves right now for their nest. Now, here's another picture of a squirrel and their dray. Now, eastern gray squirrels generally live either in dens in the cavities of trees, or they will build a dray like this, a nest, which is made up of twigs and leaves constructed high up on branches. Now, when they do give birth to their squirrel babies, the squirrel babies are born blind and hairless. Probably, perhaps to some of us, not all that cute at first sight until they get a little bit older. And their eyes don't actually open until for about 28 to 35 days. And then a little bit later, about 42 to 49 days later, that's when their furry coats are fully developed and they can just start to leave their nest. Now, when it gets really cold, we still have a little bit of time before that happens. Temperatures are dropping, but still pretty nice out there, especially in the sun. But when it gets really cold, eastern gray squirrels will actually stay in their dens or their nests for several days at a time, and will only come out to visit their stores of food wherever they've hidden some of their acorns. Now, the average squirrel in the wild will live to be about 6 years old. The oldest recorded age of a wild squirrel is 12 years, and the oldest age of a squirrel in captivity is about 20 years. Now, speaking of raising squirrels in captivity, which we do not recommend, My colleague Jose will share a link in the chat about a very interesting documentary that was made quite a while ago about someone who took in a wild squirrel and allowed it to be raised by their cat, supposedly. This wonderful documentary I saw many years ago, and it is narrated by David Attenborough. So if you enjoy squirrels and or cats, then you'll love Squirrel on My Shoulder, this very interesting, unique documentary about a cat helping to raise a squirrel. That squirrel was then later re-released successfully into the wild, which is good. That's where they belong. But our squirrel is most definitely not captive. He is here in the wild that is Central Park. So after a quick little check, the coast is clear and our squirrel friend is ready to keep continuing and make their way down the path. We're just starting to see a little glimpse of that bridge that we want to visit, and we're here. But it looks like it's not just the squirrel's favorite bridge, it's everybody's favorite bridge. There's a really big crowd here on Oak Bridge. This is really a great time to come and visit this area of Central Park because of all of the fall colors. And down here, there isn't a whole lot that the squirrel can see, just more of the latest fall fashions in sneakers and shoes than the other views that the squirrel came to enjoy from here. So our squirrel friend is going to pop up, take a little leap onto the post of the bridge, and take in some of the beautiful views that are available at Oak Bridge. And the squirrel can definitely understand why everyone is gathered here at Oak Bridge to get these glistening views of the lakes with some of the fall color and that interesting blue-gray outline of those skyscrapers in the distance. But as captivating as this view is, squirrels don't stay still for very long, so we're going to keep moving. And as the squirrel makes their way across the bridge and onto the path, they can't help but notice some of the leaf colors that are right there on the ground for them to enjoy. You can imagine maybe as a small creature, when your face is that much closer to the ground, that this is another way to go leaf peeping. You can appreciate those leaves that have fallen on the ground and see up close their unique colors and shapes. And so here, this appears to be a golden rain tree leaf, one of the leaflets from a golden rain tree leaf, really showing us some interesting oranges and yellows. And then the squirrel encounters a beautiful red-orange sweet gum leaf. These are both found just around this area as you cross Oak Bridge to go into the Ramble. But we'll keep moving and make our way down the path. And our little squirrel friend here encounters some stone steps that look pretty daunting, considering we're so tiny. However, these are not a problem for squirrels. You've probably seen squirrels bouncing and leaping all over the place in the park, so you know that these are no challenge for a squirrel. Squirrels are incredibly adept at climbing and leaping, so much so that researchers at Cornell University were interested in understanding some more about how squirrels make decisions in their interesting movements that they make and how we hardly ever see a squirrel just fall out of a tree. So the researchers at Cornell looked specifically at wild fox squirrels that were on the Cornell campus, but they operate very similarly to our eastern gray squirrels. And through close observation on ever-changing obstacles that the researchers built and developed for the squirrels, they learned that squirrels are constantly making split-second decisions, sometimes even mid-leap, changing their direction and having to change where they're going to land. And this demonstrates a great deal of creativity and innovation for the squirrels, as well as an ability to recover from mistakes. And which is why, even if they didn't land where they intended to, you usually see squirrels land on their feet. And maybe there's a lesson in there for all of us about how to recover from our mistakes and find a way to land on our feet. But let's keep moving on our feet now. And our squirrel friend notices some really beautiful, delicate green fern leaves here on the right. And so the squirrel goes in for a closer look at these ferns and the sun shining through the ferns. And then in for an even closer look, it's under the ferns, so kind of look up at the blue sky through those fern leaf shapes. Continuing on their way, the squirrel also notices these interesting growths of this moss here on a log. And this appears to be the moss Entodon seductrix. And if you hear the word seductrix, this is sometimes called seductive moss, which I suppose is seductive because it has this sort of silky nature. But the squirrel is not seduced for too long, even by this beautiful seductive moss. So we're going to keep moving and make our way down another path. And you may start to recognize a structure that you see in the ramble. You probably recognize the large cut stones of Manhattan schist as the building material of Ramblestone Arch. Now, a squirrel's experience of this bridge is a little different, of course. They can see really up close the textures and sparkly nature of the Manhattan schist. And also notice the contrast of some of the colorful leaves against those gray rocks. And even the leaf litter, a perfect view for those creatures who are so much closer to the ground than we are, shows so much variety in color and shape. Even, these are all just fallen leaves not growing on the trees anymore, but we can see a little, what appears to be a sumac, little red sumac leaf, and some maple samaras, some maple and elm leaves here, changing colors and different rates of decomposition. Hopping up to the top of Ramblestone Arch, our squirrel enjoys some more views of some of the upper tree canopy. And we'll continue on our way. The squirrel can see those glowing fall colors in the distance, glowing in the sun. And we want to capture a few more views around the lake before we end our little walk today. Now, jumping up into a branch, we get a nice elevated view of the San Remo building. And what we also notice is another oak tree, which the squirrel is pretty excited about, of course. This is a beautiful oak tree here. And the squirrel looks up and enjoys these leaves, again, against that cloudless blue sky. And another little view of the San Remo building. Now, apparently, the San Remo building, as it's a cooperative apartment building, their co-op board has a reputation for having more lenient admission standards than some of the older buildings on Fifth Avenue on the other side of the park. However, they're not so lenient that they accept squirrels, at least not knowingly. They don't have any squirrel residents. But squirrels, if you're not already aware, they don't really go in for all that wealth and status. In fact, in squirrels in 1987 and in 1994, squirrels chewed through a wire and actually shut down the NASDAQ trading floor for over an hour. So they're not really in for, all that money, and buying and selling is not really the squirrel's world. So we'll return to nature now, but the squirrel can't help but notice this "do not feed wildlife" sign. Now, the squirrel knows that this is important, and the squirrel knows that they should not be eating human food. It really doesn't make the squirrel feel very good. And just like us, when it fills up on all that junk food like bread and crackers and things like that, then the squirrel doesn't seek out acorns and the food that really provides the nutrients that the squirrel needs. But obviously, the squirrel doesn't like being reminded that he's not allowed to be given little gifts of food sometimes. And then to his left, the squirrel notices these beautiful little purple asters popping up and adding just a tiny little splash of color among the brown leaves. And this is a pretty nice place for the squirrel to end his walk because it's such a beautiful day in Central Park. It's a perfect day to be a squirrel in Central Park, or a duck, or a goose, or even a human for that matter. There's something for all of us here in Central Park to enjoy. And this is where I found my phone, was right here under the tree. And this is where the squirrel stopped taking the pictures because they found everything they needed. They had acorns, a tree to climb into, and beautiful views of the lake all around in that fall sunshine. So we only took a little walk together today, but I know I have now a deeper appreciation of these creatures that it's easy to take for granted, who are underfoot all the time, bounding all around us around Central Park. And that concludes our walk from 81st Street down across Oak Bridge with a view across the lake. And if you would like to come into the ramble and perhaps look for some squirrels yourself and observe them up close, we have a tour this Saturday with me, a ramble foliage tour to see what foliage is still changing in the ramble. And we can certainly talk a bit about squirrels too. So my colleague will drop a link in the chat for that as well, if you'd like to join us for that tour. But otherwise, I want to thank all of you for joining us again on this, I know, kind of different weekly walk that took a little bit of a different perspective in the park. And we handed control over to our little four-legged friends. But I hope you enjoyed seeing the park from a very different perspective today. But thank you for joining us. Until we see you again next week, from all of us here at the Conservancy, thank you and be well. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.